Okay, I'll resume where I was on page 12. So my goal is to focus on the mental aspect of slavery in its connection to the biological damage yielded by the implications of Willie Lynch's formula. And at the same time, give enough insight to expose his motive as well as the individual character of himself. So in other words, my purpose for writing this book is to make Willie Lynch as popular as possible, because he should receive proper credit for documenting this often used method of slave-making techniques. Mr. Lynch's article should be studied by black religious leaders, by scholars, by psychologists, and black people in general as the pivotal point for further and advancement. This letter contains Mr. Lynch's spirit and mind and expresses in depth his honest personal motive to be direct and most bluntly sincere. In true black America, as a nation, still suffers largely due to the implementation of his plan, which at its essence revolves around the deprivation of our historical base. We will cover as many topics in Willie Lynch's letter as clearly and briefly with as much detail as possible. Hopefully, this book will shed some light on the minds of black men and women in their present state of thinking, to stimulate understanding, initiate harmony, and develop functional families that will in return strengthen our people. A people unlike any other, that was stolen, brought to the Western world, and nearly mentally destroyed beyond repair. Using this book as a foundational pillar, let you, the reader, the hearer, and I begin to unite our understandings in an effort to break the curse of Willie Lynch. Can we do that, y'all? That's why I'm reading this. Let's break this curse. Come on, family. We can do it. White and black together. We can do it. Amen. If you white, just that's up to it. Okay, we did wrong. How do we correct it? And if you black, forgive, because that's how we is. We forgive. And let's go forward. Let's not look behind. Let's go forward. To every person who comes into contact with this book, take the necessary time to apply this information to your present situation. Notice how the instructions in the Willie Lynch letters are still being used in the common workplace. They're still being used in religious circles and the black home. Understand the division of the black female and the male is essential today, because these two halves are mandatory for the construction of a free-spirited, righteous, and civilized society. The next step of Willie Lynch's instruction is to create a state of mind in the male and female that repetitiously perpetrates unforgiveness of one another, while at the same time being apologetic and defensive of white authority and its wrongs. I pray that this small book is used as a reference guide for our present generation and those that follow. May our study of the great discovery aid us in our quest for peace and harmony, a harmony that has been formed for many North American black people since the capturing of the first African by the early generations of white slave traders. Many black men and women may ask the question, what is the necessity for writing a book formed by this point of view? Questions of this nature can only be produced based on the reader's assumption that we are completely free. Traditionally, we have been made to believe that an actual slave has to be a person physically bound by the shackle, a ball, and a chain. But time has proven that this is not the case with the Africans, who are shackled mentally and trained to voluntarily carry the awesome burden of building the economy of this luxury-filled country called America. How to read this book. Here's instructions on how to read this book. The study of this subject matter requires the following instructions. This book must be read completely from the very beginning to the end, and from the end to the beginning in reverse order, in which the chapters were originally arranged. Reading Breaking the Curse of Willie Lynch in this order is very similar to the process slave makers use to rearrange the black slave's natural orientation of mind. The reason so is to provoke the reader to cover the past and the future order of the effects of such slave conditioning, while staying connected with the present moment. This process allows each individual to break the repetitive cycle that has caused us to subconsciously pivot from a point of disadvantage. Secondly, keep in mind that words italicized in bold print come directly from the mind and the mouth of professional slave makers during the plantation era. The things in italics. So I will try and mention when it comes to things in italics. All right? Chapter 1, Slaves in the Making. Let's ask ourselves the questions. What makes a person a slave? A slave is a person under the manipulation or physical confines of another brought about by brute force or carefully skilled trickery or deceit. We as a people have already developed a common definition describing the 400 years of forced labor. But many of us have not carefully deciphered the code or the modern slave-making methods of white corporate slaveholders. In a nutshell, a modern slave can easily be defined as a person that carries in his or her mind the old ideas, plans, and will of the old traditional slave maker. Even though they are no longer physically detained, normally this discussion would have already ended, but due to the continued effective nature of Willie Lynch's letters, we must carry on. As a foundation, let's examine the words of this letter. In doing so, we will get more in touch with the underlying motive behind Mr. Lynch's psychological motives in developing the method for making the black man and woman into the type of slave we are about to describe. Somewhere deep down in the mind of the white slave master was, and still is, a deep fear of the people that they oppress. Beneath that fear is the lack of confidence in their own ability, connected to an understanding of the greater ability of the people, that they feel must be mastered for purposes of mental security. This state of mind has been internalized and planted more firmly into the heart and soul of black people in the United States. More than any other, the other slaves throughout the history and world dominated by white slave masters. So before going any further, several differences surrounding the trade and the making of the African into a slave must be made clear. The first point to be made clear is that the actual trade of black slaves did not by itself cause the more potent form of mental damage that blacks suffer from today. Even though families and nations had been physically divided to the point where languages and dialogue had been cut off. From the start, an already developing communication problem had now been amplified and made extremely complicated. Those of us who share the slave experience already see that the present-day problems in the black family are based on the structure that the black family was left with during slavery. This is manifested today in the stress-filled tone of communication between many black men and women versus a free-flowing dialogue that produces mutual cooperation instead of conflicts between egos. This does not include the exception of the rare cases where black people have re-wedged and benefited from a stable family unit. Over the present issue, in the making of a slave over 400 years later, has presented us with the dilemma that something more serious than the kidnapping of physical murder and sale of our bodies had to happen to black people here in North America. Notice that in any discipline where one may strive to obtain the level of mastery, the objection in mastering something difficult is that the subject has to become easy to master. So making overcoming the difficulty in the control factor of your subject is a sign that you have successfully mastered the subject. So during the time in history when black bodies were clothed in chains, the slave master obviously saw a flaw in his tactics of control when enforcing his barbaric practices, or torture, or fear, or beating, and murder by example to obtain control when dealing with his Negro slaves. The problem described in this book lies more along the lines of the slave master's desire to implement a more evolved type of control over his human livestock. Y'all heard me what I said, livestock. Today, most blacks are still segregated group living. Today, most blacks are still a segregated group living under America's failing economy and are short of the basic desired goal of freedom, which includes control of our time, control of our own destiny, and control of our own self-money. We will look at Willie Lynch's program from the position of a long-range plan of economic development and profitable security. How could you enslave, rape, mistreat, and even kill the family members of those under your authority, and at the same time secure the making of a slave and make monetary profits? What must be done to the mind of a people who've gone through such conditioning and still carry on their daily service to the people who have perpetrated this atrocity nearly a century and a half after they have been so-called free? That's why y'all see what's going on in the streets today. Because these young blacks and whites have become mentally awakened, and they're not taking it anymore. They're breaking, they're finally figuring out how to break this curse. So the Caucasian slave masters understood the depths of their own psyche in relationship to the true differences between the phrases slave maker and slave master. The first 300 years of the American enslavement of the African dealt with the physical captivity, report, and the trade of black bodies. But there is a second phase of this story that incorporates the two different understandings stated. Black people as a whole must not only define things for our slaves to color and set the tone of our own picture, which is reality, but we must understand in detail the definitions of those who continue in their attempt to further control our future. The slave maker can be defined as a person who uses the barbaric tactics of torture, fear, beating, and murder by example alone to obtain control. Secondly, a slave master is a person who has studied the spirit, the soul, and the psychology on a subject in order to master the internal operating principles that actually makes the person tick. Historically, a title had not up until recently been given to this system, nor had an individual been credited with the development and packaging of such a productive system until the discovery of Willie Lynch letters. Lynch and company somehow were able to conceptualize the very essence of slave-making methods. The amazement of the matter is that after reading the letter 290 years later, the spiritual drugs of division documented in the archives of this speech have held true exactly as Mr. Lynch stated. And he is putting in parentheses, he is quoting, "The minimum test of time in which this method, if used, would control the minds of the Negro slave for at least 300 years. And we write about that 300-year mark, right about 1717 to 2000, right about 300 years. So at least 300 years. So the second phase of the curse of the Willie Lynch included the strong prediction that the utilization of his method would ensure the control of the Negro state of mind for at least an entire millennium, 1,000 years. My question to challenge the thoughts of the readers is, can we afford another generation of ours to continue the slave master-slave relationship? Well, what must be done and studied to prevent the continued tradition of this relationship? Because whether we realize it or not, white America no longer has the need for a codependent relationship with the once shackled slave. To make matters worse, the American economy after the 9/11 bombing can no longer support the weight of carrying the responsibility of a mastered slave. Okay, we're into the last section. We have 7 minutes. We're doing pretty good. It's 1:27. I was hoping it'd be like about 30 minutes, but here we go. Chapter 2. Black animalization. Never heard of that word before. Animalization. Okay, in italics, this is what Willie Lynch said. What we do with horses is that we break them from one form of life to another. So that is, we reduce them from the natural state in nature, whereas nature provides them with the natural capacity to take care of their needs and the needs of their offsprings. We break their natural string of independence from them and thereby create a dependency state so that we may be able to get from them useful production for our business and for our pleasure. Okay. So the wounds acquired from the slave experience over time have inflicted enough physical, social, and economic damage to prove that blacks as a people have been animalized. Before going any further, let's review the definition of animal as described in the Webster Dictionary. Number 1, any such organism other than a human being. Number 2, a brutish, debased, or inhuman person. So here we will expound on the second description, stating that an animal is inhuman or debased. When something or someone has been debased, they become disconnected from their foundation. In the process, they're detached from the very core of their being that gives them value. That is the case of the Negro slave. The very culture, norms, and values that allowed us to uplift and civilize our citizens according to our own standards. What makes man and woman civilized? What makes us uncivilized? A people are considered civilized when they act in accordance to their understanding of the knowledge of the nature of themselves. In the reverse, a person becomes uncivilized when they become subject and governed by the lower negative element of their nature, which in most cases is due to the absence of an inherent relative self-knowledge connecting them to Mother Nature that some call the universe, or even better yet, all-inclusive God. In the process of making a slave, the African was eventually stripped of any remaining background that would allow the black masses to connect with their natural divinity, or even yet claim their kinship to being made in the image and likeness of God. Wise people throughout the years have taught us to know thyself, but in the life of the overwhelming majority of Negro slaves confined to the American plantation, there was never provided the opportunity under safe conditions that would enable the Negro to ever publicly regain his humanity. In most cases, the stronger or more educated Negro was killed outright in front of the rest of the slaves. As an example, what happens to a Negro boy slave when he decides to become a human? This example was then and is presently used as a system of checks and balances in order to mentally produce fear in the Negro, thus hindering an entire race of people from achieving true liberation. They put their knee on your neck, they shoot you in the back, they shoot you when you're running away. That's what they'll do. Put the fear in them Negroes, and they'll behave. They'll behave. Making men exist in the state of an animal is a twofold process. First, there is the destruction of the decent morals, which include the perversion of the people's traditional native religious practices, and governing social norms. These laws, rules, and regulations serve as guidelines, or people's internal fortress to protect the society and its citizens from foreign disruption and disorder. As during the years of the physical bondage, the bulk of the black community today is suffering internally because of the debasement of our human foundation. That foundation consists of a high level of moral, ethical conduct supported by belief in the laws of nature. Secondly, The dehumanization of the African happened during the entire process of kidnapping, slave, and forced enslavement. This included the housing of the masses of slaves in hay-filled barns with the beasts of the field, a process that included the installation of gold or silver caps on the front teeth of the black slaves for the purpose of identification. Did y'all hear that, black men? Y'all young kids running around with them black gold plates on y'all teeth. You're just going back to the behaving like they taught you in the slavery that many of us today wear for decoration. In most cases, this was the treatment given to the house Negroes, it says. But most wore the master's mark burned by the branding iron heated with burning coals. This is one of the early stages of dehumanization suffered by the Negro slave. And like then, today, many of us wear the symbols of the legacy of our oppressors on our black bodies. The second phase deals with the spiritual perversion of a people based on training the black African under a Western psychologically domesticated system of indoctrination. This starts the very moment when a people are stripped of the personal duties and responsibilities of doing for themselves under a system organized and constructed by their own peers. The Willie Lynch method explained this as the creation of a state of dependency. In modern terms, a welfare state, and any black male or female that does anything other than the norm could easily be classified as an enemy of the state. That's why they shoot you down, put their knee on your neck. You're an enemy of the state. So we as black people should be aware that the moment we begin to depend on someone else to do for us what with unity we can do for ourselves, we've given them power over our lives. This automatically gives the old slave master and his offsprings the upper hand. So as a nation, blacks continue to suffer economically during the era of the Freedman's Bureau. In our ignorance to do something for ourselves, we were forced to turn right back around and offer black labor to the former slave masters in the form of sharecropping. Look very carefully in the name of the committee organized to conceptualize and define what freedom would be to the Negro slave. After being released from their state of physical captivity, the word freed in the term Freedman's Bureau implies that we were released by the permission of another power, and we had no responsibility in the planning of our own liberation. Proof is in the underlying root meaning of freed man. We as a people, never get true respect equal to the level of other nations because we had nothing to do with our own freedom. Therefore, 137 years later, we still do not enjoy nor do we benefit from the fruits of our labor as a whole, like people from other cultures that recently crossed over the borders of America. May the Lord add a blessing to you, the hearer, and me, the reader. That was about 35 minutes, about a 30-minute read. I'm going to shut down, and I will be back. What time is this? 1 o'clock? I'll come back at 3, I think. At 3. So I take a break, which I need. And I'll be back at 3. And then we will read Understanding Division, the psycho-alteration of the biochemical. This takes some out of you reading this stuff. Takes some out of you reading this stuff. But it's to help enlighten us, to help us know where we are, where we're going, how we got where we are. Isn't this good thus far? Isn't this good? It's a mandate from God. God got me doing it. Okay, I love everybody. I love everybody. This read is not to hurt. This read is to help. Praise God. All right. I'll see you guys back